Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class from HowStuffWorks.com. This podcast is brought to you by Audible.com, the internet's leading provider of audiobooks, with more than 100,000 downloadable titles across all types of literature. For Stuff You Missed in History Class listeners, Audible is offering a free audiobook to give you a chance to try out their service. One audiobook to consider is 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus by Charles C. Mann. A favorite among How Stuff Works staff, this book rewrites the history of North America in a well-researched and compelling way. That's 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus by Charles C. Mann, available from Audible. To try Audible free today and to get a free audiobook of your choice, go to audiblepodcast.com/historystuff. That's audiblepodcast.com/historystuff.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Deblina Chakraborty.
And I'm Sarah Dowdy.
And with this episode, we're continuing on with our look into the life of William Chester Minor, an American man who became one of the most prolific contributors to the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary. But from what we've seen of his life so far, he doesn't really seem to be headed in that direction at all.
No.
In part one of this podcast, we took a look at Minor's early life, how he came from an aristocratic family, he got a good education, he studied medicine at Yale and joined the Union Army as an assistant surgeon during the Civil War. And his life and career at that point seemed really full of promise, but his mental health went downhill after the war, and we talked about how that downward spiral may have been triggered by an incident during the Battle of the Wilderness, in which he was forced to brand an Irish deserter on the cheek. After spending about 18 months in a hospital for the insane in D.C., Minor decided to head across the pond to England, where he could hopefully rest, paint, kind of calm his thoughts a bit, maybe earn back his reputation by connecting with the right people in London. But when we last saw Minor, he'd done nothing like that.
No, it didn't go down that way at all. He had gotten off on the wrong foot by taking up residence in Lambeth, which was one of the seediest parts of London. And when we left off with part one of this story, he had just killed a man who he'd never laid eyes on before. So we're going to pick up at that crime, February 17th, 1872, just as the constables were reaching the scene, finding Minor standing there, gun in hand.
And we should mention, before we get too far into this, that one of the sources of information in this podcast is Simon Winchester's book, The Professor and the Madman. One of our listeners actually mentioned it on Facebook, so it reminded me that I need to bring it up and talk about it a little bit. It's a really fascinating book. It takes a really in-depth look at Minor's story and some of the other characters here.
Definitive work on his life, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. A lot of articles about Minor use this as a source, too. So even the other sources we use probably pulled from that to some extent. So moving on with the story, though, the man that Minor had shot was bleeding all over the street. Two constables tried to get him to a nearby hospital, but it was too late. They identified the dead man as George Merritt, who'd been a stoker at the Red Lion Brewery, which was something of a landmark in the area, even though the area wasn't that great. And he'd been there for 8 years, which meant that he being a stoker meant that he kept the fires over which the beer was made burning. Obviously, that wasn't a glamorous job. This guy brought home 24 shillings a week, which wasn't a lot even back then. He was very poor, and he also had a wife and 6 kids and one more baby on the way.
Yeah, so a lot of family relying on him. He was about 34 years old, and he did live in the area. And when he ran into Minor, he had been on his way to work at the dawn shift of the brewery, so it's about 2 a.m., heading out, runs into this guy on the street who ends up shooting him. So meanwhile, the constable who apprehended Minor, who was Constable Tarrant, had what was sort of a strange exchange with the suspect. He asked him, "Whom did you fire at?" And Minor, who Tarrant described as really cool and collected, gave this bizarre response. He said, "It was a man. You do not suppose I would be so cowardly as to shoot a woman?" So not really the response he was probably expecting to get out of him. Tarrant proceeded to take Minor down to the Tower Street police station, ask some questions. On the way, though, Minor started to say that the whole thing was an accident, started to give a little more reason, maybe more of what Tarrant had been expecting in the first place. He was just saying he'd shot the wrong man. He had been trying to defend himself from somebody who'd broken into his room, and he'd made a mistake.
He was also saying a lot of other weird stuff on the way to the police station, too, so you could see how maybe the constable wouldn't quite believe him. He was asking the constable to search him. He was like, well, what if I have another gun? And the constable was like, well, please keep it in your pocket if you have another gun. I mean, it was really kind of an odd sort of interaction that they had. But when they got to the station, Miner was formally arrested and charged with murder. Because he was American, the U.S. minister in London had to be notified, and the crime, which became known as the Lambeth tragedy, became an international incident. And Miner was 37 years old at this time, just to give you kind of a reference point.
Okay, so at this point, Miner got put into the Horsemonger Land Jail, and Scotland Yard got put on the case. So Miner himself wasn't really much of a help. I mean, this is no surprise. He wasn't much of a help with the investigation. He just continued to say over and over, it was an accident. You know, I shot the wrong man. But when the trial started in early April, details about Miner's strange life started to surface through the help of various witnesses. His Lambeth landlady, for instance, came forward, Mrs. Fisher, and she said that while he was a very good tenant, he was kind of a strange fellow. He was anxious. He'd often demand to have the furniture in his room moved around and rearranged, and he was really, really afraid that people might break into his place.
In particular, she said that he was very afraid of the Irish. He would always ask if she had any Irish servants working in the house or if there were any Irish lodgers staying there. In part one of this podcast, we mentioned Miner's delusions about Irishmen breaking into his room at night and how it was probably related to that branding incident during the Civil War when he had to brand the Irish deserter on the cheek. And we talked about how he'd already contacted Scotland Yard about this. During the trial, a Scotland Yard detective named Williamson, in fact, came forward and testified that Miner had come to him 3 months earlier, complaining that men were trying to come into his room at night and poison him. Specifically, Miner believed the intruders were members of the Fenian Brotherhood, militant Irish nationalists, and he thought they were planning on murdering him and making it look like a suicide.
And other people, you know, people who had met Miner and spoken to him before, did have a suspicion that something was off with him. Williamson, the guy who Miner went to, wrote in his notes from that time that Miner was clearly insane. But there was another aspect to Miner's delusions as well. Another man who testified at the trial was William Dennis, and he was an employee at London's Bethlehem Hospital for the Insane. We've talked about maybe doing a podcast on that at some point. But his job was to watch Miner at night when he was in jail. And Dennis said that every morning when Miner would wake up, he would accuse Dennis of having been paid to molest Miner during the night while he was asleep. And Miner's stepbrother, George Miner, would later confirm these delusions about sexual abuse, saying that for the time that Miner was home before he left for England, he would often accuse people of trying to break into his room and molest him at night. So it wasn't just this fear of somebody breaking in or the Irish trying to get him. There was this whole other aspect to it.
Yeah, the sexual aspect of his delusions. And I think that's why some people relate sort of his mental illness, or maybe relate the beginning of his mental illness to the lascivious thoughts that we mentioned in the first part of this podcast that he used to have about girls in Sri Lanka when he was growing up. That maybe
and
that
his
was
concern over it too.
Exactly, maybe that was an early indication of mental illness, I should say. So Miner himself pretty much confirmed this aspect of his delusions when he was interrogated too. He testified that on the night that he killed George Merritt, he woke up suddenly and saw a man standing at the foot of his bed. So he reached for his Colt Service revolver, which he kept under his pillow while he slept, and he said that the man saw him reach for his gun and then took off and ran down the stairs and out of the house. Miner followed him and then saw a man running down the street, thought it was the intruder, fired 4 times, and shot him. That's his side of the story anyway.
It was really our poor brewery employee. But the final decision in the case was determined by the McNaughton rules, which were named for somebody who had shot a man and was acquitted on the grounds of being insane. And the jury in Miner's case determined that he was also of unsound mind when he had committed the crime. So the ruling was not guilty on the grounds of insanity. And the judge told him, quote, "You will be detained in safe custody, Dr. Miner, until Her Majesty's pleasure be known." So we already know where Miner was sent from the